The conservation of the peat swamp ecosystem is part of the Sabah Forestry Department's mission. The initiatives provide continuous alternative livelihoods for local communities, eco-tourism opportunities, as well as avenues for environmental protection. A fine example of such an endeavor is the Klias Forest Reserve Conservation Plan that was conceived in 2007. The plan addresses the urgent need for holistic management of the peat swamp ecosystem in the state of Sabah in Malaysia. The Peat Swamp Conservation Project was initiated in 2002 by the Malaysian government with the support from the United Nations Development Programme. It is funded by the Global Environment Facility and the Danish International Development Assistance. The project is a multi-stakeholders endeavor initiated by various state and federal government agencies with the assistance of local NGOs and communities. The Klias Forest Reserve is classified as a Class 1 forest reserve destined for environmental protection purposes. Unfortunately, large areas surrounding the reserve had been cleared to pave way for agricultural and other development purposes. In many cases, poor planning led to the degradation of peat lands, which provide a constant threat of fire outbreaks. Therefore, a conservation strategy for these peat lands has become an important focal point. The objective is to keep the peat deposit intact, waterlogged and under some form of vegetation cover.
Klias Forest Reserve, in my opinion, is the single most important peat swamp forest left in Sabah. Although it had been logged some 40-50 years ago, the forest itself is still in relatively good condition. We started with about 160,000 hectares of peat swamp forest in Sabah, and most of it is been alienated or instead land, and there remains about 50,000 hectares of peat swamp forest in reserves. But unfortunately, because of the risk of fire and peat swamps being naturally vulnerable to fires, most of our peat swamp forests have been disturbed or degraded as a consequence of bad logging practices of the past or forest fires in recent past or forest fires in recent times. Klias, therefore, is a pristine forest that is of global importance. It is a high conservation value forest which we must protect at all costs. The threats are enormous, particularly from fires and bad development practices around them. And we must ensure that we are able to manage these challenges and continue to let Klias thrive in its natural condition.
In order to develop the Klias Forest Reserve Conservation Plan, a management core team was set up comprising various relevant state agencies, namely Forestry, Lands and Survey, Drainage and Irrigation, Environmental Protection, Agriculture, Wildlife, and the Beaufort Local Authority. The aim is to determine key ecological targets for conservation purposes.
Among the imminent threats we have faced at this forest reserve is the continued clearance of adjoining peatlands. Another threat is the construction of drains to lower the water table to make the land more suitable for agriculture. This has led to several negative consequences, one of which is the drying out of the peat in the forest reserve, resulting in rapid decomposing and leading to subsidence. Once this occurs, the peat becomes extremely susceptible to fire and is very difficult to contain once it ignites.
In February 2010, the Sabah Forestry Department had to mobilize a large group of personnel from other parts of the state to assist its officials at Klias in preventing the spread of bushfires into the reserve areas. With the support given by personnel of the Fire and Rescue Department and local residents, they were successful in doing so. To facilitate action towards the conservation of the biodiversity of the Klias Forest Reserve, a field centre was established and it has been in operation since 2006. Since then, the centre has been progressively implementing conservation initiatives. The Forest Field Centre has become the springboard for conservation and forest restoration activities, all aimed towards the fulfillment of the conservation plan.
For any conservation initiative to work in peat swamp area, it all depends on the understanding of three basic principles. The first one is to ensure enough vegetation above ground surface as a biomass media to avoid direct exposure of peat layer. The second one is to ensure that the groundwater table is maintained to a certain level to avoid oxidation of peat soil. And lastly, but not the least, degraded or open areas need to be restored as quickly as possible to avoid prolonged and extreme environmental exposure, which will then lead to peat subsidence.
At the same time, the Klias Forest Field Centre has become a focal point for forestry and environmental specialists, scientists, academicians and students to undertake field studies and research works on various fields. The reserve is considered still intake connected with the mangrove ecosystem, Nipah forest and transitional riverine vegetation at the southern part. This forest field centre at the Klias Forest Reserve, located only about 7 kilometres from Beaufort town, is becoming a popular centre for ecotourism, recreation and relaxation for locals as well as visitors from other parts of Sabah and abroad. It boasts of a 2.5 kilometre long boardwalk that rings through the peat swamp forests and has hostel facilities for overnight stay. Visitors, young and old, have a variety of attractions to select from. A trek through the peat swamp forest is a natural choice. An educational tour to study the rich flora is another rewarding activity. Much intimate knowledge on the wide range of trees, plants and flowers can be gained from it.
These peat swamp forests play a vital role, not only to ensure water supply, land stability and flood mitigation, but also a source of invaluable flora and fauna. Here one can find a rich pool of biodiversity, giving visitors endless opportunity to explore and discover God-given nature. This center had also much to offer visitors who have particular interest in forestry and the nature environment.
Visitors could take a leisurely river cruise in the early evening, during which they could view at close range the proboscis monkeys moving around in their natural habitat by the banks of the Garama River. Nature studies could include bird watching. spotting and photographing large resident water birds such as storks and herons at their undisturbed wetland habitat and safe nest trees are a delightful pastime. A stroll along the Belian boardwalk anytime during the day or under a moonlit sky is a distinct draw, especially for the adventurous and the young at heart. The accommodation and canteen facilities at the centre are clean and comfortable. Various ethnic communities live within the Klias Peninsula, especially along the banks of nearby rivers. Their main sources of income are from perennial and cash crops such as fruit trees, oil palm, paddy, rubber, fishing, and maintaining aquaculture ponds. Forestry officials work closely with these local communities to ensure that they support the conservation plan and could generate income from employment on forest conservation and restoration projects. Looking ahead and learning from recent past events, there is now an urgent need to include certain peat swamp lands adjoining to the Klias Forest Reserve to be zoned as a protection area. Such a protection area would also serve as a buffer zone against the spread of fires into the Klias Forest Reserve. This task to promote the conservation of sustainable use of the fragile ecosystem of tropical peat swamp forests is an ongoing affair. This is yet another action plan of the government in support of the sustainable management of rainforests in the state of Sabah, Malaysia.
Pemeliharaan ekosistem hutan paya gambut merupakan sebahagian daripada misi Jabatan Perhutanan Sabah. Inisiatif ini turut menyediakan peluang pendapatan sampingan berterusan kepada masyarakat tempatan pembangunan ekopelancongan selain daripada melindungi persekitarannya. Contoh terbaik ialah Pelan Pemeliharaan Hutan Simpan Klias yang telah disediakan pada tahun 2007. Pelan itu menekankan keperluan pengurusan secara menyeluruh terhadap ekosistem hutan paya gambut di Semenanjung Klias. Projek pemeliharaan hutan paya gambut dimulakan pada tahun 2002 oleh Kerajaan Malaysia dengan bantuan pembangunan antarabangsa Denmark, Danish International Development Assistance, dan sokongan daripada Program Pembangunan Pertubuhan Bangsa-Bangsa Bersatu melalui peruntukan kemudahan alam sekitar global, Global Environment Facility. Projek ini merupakan usaha sama oleh pelbagai pihak yang mana terdiri daripada agensi-agensi kerajaan negeri dan kerajaan persekutuan dengan bantuan badan-badan bukan kerajaan, NGO serta penglibatan masyarakat setempat. Hutan Simpan Klias diklasifikasikan sebagai hutan simpan kelas 1 yang berfungsi bagi tujuan pemeliharaan alam sekitar. Namun begitu, kebanyakan kawasan di sekitar hutan simpan ini telah diterokai bagi memberi laluan kepada pembangunan pertanian dan lain-lain aktiviti. Dalam kebanyakan kes, aktiviti